Welcome back in. It's the Lions247 Podcast. Happy to be with you once again as we go through another week here in February. We'll have a couple episodes for you. Our last one came out last Friday. In case you missed that one, Tyler Calvaruso, our resident recruiting insider, joined me. Talked a lot about some names that you need to know in this 2026 recruiting cycle, but we spent a good portion of that latest episode breaking down the hiring of Stan Drayton as Penn State's running backs coach, a big-time respected veteran of the college football world, also a guy that has experience in the NFL as a coach with the Green Bay Packers, more recently running backs coach with the Chicago Bears. We're going to break down some of the best seasons that have been put together by running backs under his watch, what that might mean for Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen as seniors, and really overall reset this room a bit on this episode of the Lions247 Podcast. We'll also take a closer look at the receiver room this episode because about a month or so out of spring practices, we have a lot to learn about that position unit. Lost 4 guys to the transfer portal, added 2 players from the transfer portal. It's added 3 freshmen. There's a lot to work through. And we'll finish out this episode by breaking down some players outside of those position groups on the offensive side of the ball who carried momentum into this 2025 offseason. To help me navigate through all those conversations, we bring in Daniel Gallen now, colleague at Lions247.com. And Daniel, I just reminded folks we have that episode up from Friday, and Tyler Calvaruso did a great job discussing some of the potential recruiting ramifications of Stan Drayton coming on board. And since that episode, Penn State has formally introduced him as their running backs coach. We hope to get an opportunity in a press conference setting to speak with Stan Drayton about why he made this move and what he looks forward to about working in Happy Valley. That hasn't happened yet, nothing on the schedule quite yet. But Daniel, your initial reaction now that we're a few days into this being a reality, Stan Drayton, the 53-year-old guy who was Urban Meyer's running backs coach for the Florida Gators and Ohio State Buckeyes during championship runs for those 2 programs. Now he walks into the Lash building, replaces a 7-year veteran at that position and Jaywan Sider, and inherits 2 running backs who've already accomplished so much in Nittany Lions uniforms.
Yeah, I think that this was a really, really good move for James Franklin. And I think that things came together pretty well for Penn State when you consider when the news broke of Jaywan Sider leaving in the coaching carousel cycle, in the hiring cycle. And so to survey the landscape, I know that you had Drayton down as someone to watch pretty much from the jump, and looking at, and then James Franklin dropped a couple of breadcrumbs, I think, in terms of what he was looking for and footprint and experience and all these different things. And you could kind of triangulate a little bit on Stan Drayton. And so I think this is a really good move for Penn State. We know what they have coming back. We know what they have coming into that room. We know, who the guys are that looking forward in the room, who could be the next guys in that room. And so, Drayton walks into a, position group that has a lot of potential and, has some things established, but also some room to grow. I mean, we've seen Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton continue to evolve over their careers, and, they finished the season really strong. It wasn't strong all the way through. And so there's still room, for Stan Drayton to develop those guys, help them take the next step, keep them fresh for the next level. And I just think this is a very, very solid move for James Franklin. And I think it's one that could work out really well.
Daniel, a couple of interesting departures for Penn State to deal with. When you play late into the season and you're one of those Final Four teams, James Franklin referenced this, it's going to impact, on the other end, what you're going to do the following year. We've heard about that with some of the winter workout structure, maybe the spring practices being impacted. But in terms of trying to figure out the market for coaches when you have to replace them, one in mid-January, the other in early February. Now that we have seen how Penn State has responded to those opportunities, maybe challenges, by bringing in Knowles from Ohio State and now Drayton, who was in the unemployment market at this point, but he was fired by Temple last year, a guy who's probably got money coming his way from the Owls, so probably could have taken some time. So to see how they filled those 2 spots with these 2 particular highly respected college football industry veterans, this is year 4 for you covering the team. It's my 8th year covering the team, and I'm shortchanging you, correct me.
But going into year 5.
Going into year 5. So you have a pretty good lay of the land here, as do I at this point. Does it feel a little bit different the way things have turned out the last month? And you kind of throw on some of the roster retention that Penn State has shown in keeping guys on campus for 2025. Does it feel different right now before we get to see this team on the field again next month?
Yeah, I think it feels a little bit different. I think that when you look at the way that James Franklin has handled openings in the past. I think that he's always been really opportunistic with some of the hires that he's made. I think about the Manny Diaz one a lot, which that was one that really worked out for them. The timing lined up, Penn State was able to pounce, and it worked out really well for both sides. I think when you think about what this team did under Diaz and what Manny Diaz was able to do for that, next chapter in his career. But I think that in terms of the player retention, I think that that is a really big deal this year. And then I think the Knowles hire is just something a little bit different that we haven't seen before. I think the Stan Drayton hire, while that's a really big one, I think that goes in that Manny Diaz bucket a little bit where, timing worked out pretty well, mutual thing for both sides. It can help both sides moving forward. I think that that was more of that, whereas the Knowles hire was, I think, the big game hunting, going out, getting someone with that pedigree, who was at Ohio State, had just won a national championship. I think that that is the signal. And then the player retention piece of it. We've talked about it in the past where some of the early entrants that Penn State has had into the draft. And there's always been a couple where you're like, they probably could have come back for another year, or, what would it have taken to get them to come back for a year? I think with this core group that you have coming back, it shows that, Penn State behind the scenes is moving things around, using its resources, and, is trying to get that to pay off on Saturdays in the fall, into the winter.
Yeah. When it comes to Stan Drayton, I think my mind's just we're only 8 days or 9 days removed from J1 Sider news breaking that he'd be heading to Notre Dame. And by the way, no official announcement yet from Notre Dame, but we have seen some social media posts from J1 Sider out in South Bend, Indiana. I think he's getting to work there. We'll see when it comes officially official. But in terms of filling that was fast. I mean, by Friday, you're going Sunday to Friday, Stan Drayton's announced as your running backs coach. And you consider the list that we put together early last week. I'm sure people were following other outlets who had lists out there. And in my mind, Daniel, Drayton's the only guy that can walk into this facility and have you thinking, as someone who covers the team or follows the team, that you may have just maybe had an upgrade. We got to see what it looks like when they get on the field. But it feels like you may have upgraded that position somehow after losing J1 Sider 7 years, guy who was really beloved in that running back room. We've given Sider his flowers over the past several years. And so for him to move on and for us to, within a week of that, say, Penn State might have actually gotten better in the running back room. It certainly doesn't seem like they've gotten worse. I think there's a lot of candidates out there you could have hired and said, this is an up-and-comer, something that James Franklin referenced, but you're wondering, are they really going to have their footing within this situation, within this program before 2026? With Stan Drayton, he has been in the bunker preparing for national championship games with two different blue blood programs in his career. And so I think he checks off so many things on the box. And as we'll get to in a moment, the monsters that he has produced or helped produce at running back and some of the years they have put up, Daniel, to me, it's just it is a fortuitous thing where you don't have to pry him away from another job, but he is the guy that I felt like, and you could have listed maybe 20 running backs coaches who could have replaced Sider a week ago. He's the one guy that I felt like he comes here, it dispels a lot of potential concerns that you would have had in other situations where another candidate takes this job.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that when you looked at the lay of the land and this sort of cycle, it was sort of, you looked at it and you were like, well, it's either Drayton or it's someone completely out of left field that would make you feel, really confident about this hire. But I think a lot of it goes back to James Franklin. And I think the way that he's built these staffs and the way that you looked at things, I think that you kind of got to give him the benefit of the doubt now when it comes to coaching moves. I mean, your defensive coordinator, up and leaves after 1 year for a lateral move. A couple weeks later, your running backs coach, who had been become a core member of the staff and maybe one of the more recognizable figures, partially because of his longevity, his personality, the players he was coaching. He also goes out for I think what will be a lateral move. We'll see what kind of titles Notre Dame gives him when that officially gets announced. And I think that, we saw the reaction on our board, which we love. All of our posters and that unfiltered emotion. I think I really appreciate it. But I think that moving forward now, it's when there's a coaching change. I think with James Franklin, you can kind of sit back and say, kind of like, okay, like let's see in a couple days, let's see in a couple weeks. This isn't, this might not seem as devastating, once the dust settles and everything. I know that with Sider leaving, I mean, I was surprised. Like I texted you and Mark, and I was just kind of like, what? And then, a couple of days later, everything settles out, and you're kind of like, oh, okay, this is fine. And I think that kind of epitomizes the way that James Franklin is running his program right now, where you have some of these fires popping up in terms of player retention, personnel, things like that. And it seems like, oh no, like, the whole thing could come falling down. Then a couple of days later, it's kind of like, oh, okay. Like we see what the vision is, what the pathway is here. So I think that it's been a really good offseason and a couple of different ways for James Franklin and Penn State. And the way this staff has been reshaped is definitely one of them.
And it probably speaks volumes about the whatever the war chest that has been provided to James Franklin from Pat Kraft and the administration at Penn State, because as we heard from Jim Knowles, it wasn't like he was on the phone with Pat Kraft hammering out contract details. Maybe that happened later with an agent, but Jim Knowles said it was James Franklin and him going back and forth with the sense that Pat Kraft was there in support of James Franklin and what he needed to get done. I'd imagine we'll hear a similar scenario played out between Stan Drayton and James Franklin. But again, it's important that he knows that support is present, because a coach can go and promise things, but if he can't actually deliver them, then you're not going to hire the guy. And we've seen them come up with some big hires here in the winter of 2025. We talked about it before. Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, whoever came to campus was getting proven commodities, guys that still have room to grow, guys that want to improve their stock in the NFL when that eventually comes around next year. But here's what it comes down to, Daniel. These guys are going into their final year in Nittany Lions uniforms with a chance to go 1 and number 2 on the all-time rushing board for Penn State. Nick Singleton needs 1,021 yards to be number 1 on that list. He had 1,099 yards last year. Katron Allen needs 1,055 yards to be number 1 on that list. He had 1,108 last year. So again, if they can duplicate what they did last year, they'll be neck and neck trying to figure out who leaves campus as the number 1 all-time rusher in Penn State football history. With that in mind, what kind of an advantage does that give Stan Drayton as he comes to town, gets into that room, starts to sink his teeth into the situation? We'll get to some of the younger components later, but he knows who the 2 guys are leading the way, and that's going to remain the case as long as they're healthy for the next 7, 8, 9 months.
Yeah, I think you've got 2 guys at the top who know how to take care of business, who at this point in their careers are essentially professionals, given what they've been through, what they've seen, how Jaywan Sider coached them. We saw them at our looks at practices. We've seen Jaywan Sider in the camp settings. I mean, he can be a pretty exacting coach in certain areas. And so you've got 2 guys in Singleton and Allen who have, been coached hard, been coached closely, and I think know at this point in their careers what they need to do to be successful. And I think if you're Stan Drayton, that helps a lot, because it's not like you're resetting the whole room and trying to create your own culture. You have something that you can fit into a little bit. Obviously, he's a coach. He's going to make his own changes. There's going to be things that are different. But I think in terms of coming into a room and you already have things established, the way that Quentin Martin and Corey Smith talked about Katron Allen and Nick Singleton after the coaching change news broke, it sounded like that those are 2 guys who are really comfortable in being leaders for the younger guys too. So I think you're walking into not only 2 of the best running backs in the country, potentially the best running back duo in the country, but you've got 2 strong leaders who know how to lead these younger players, know how to bring them along, and are going to be assets to you as a position coach as you try to, figure things out, put your own stamp on it, get these guys set for what's to come.
I think it's one thing if Drayton shows up in February 2023 and they're coming off that freshman year and they feel like they've figured everything out. They didn't have that sophomore slump-ish kind of a year yet and been humbled by that and then had to build themselves back up. So they've already had their own roller coaster ride at the college level. I think they've learned a lot about themselves. They learned a lot and probably appreciate the ability to share the load more than they did when they were freshmen and they both wanted the ball 25 times a game. And so I think with that, you have a lot of built-in goodwill for Stan Drayton. I think on the other end is, well, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, if they need some convincing, I would encourage them to head over to Lions247.com and check out the piece we put up Saturday, breaking down some of the best running back seasons that have been produced under Stan Drayton's watch. And I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details here, but I'll highlight a few, Daniel. You got back-to-back seasons at Ohio State in 2013 and 2014, 2 different running backs Carlos Hyde is the first in 2013. He jumped from 970 rushing yards the year before to 1,500 rushing yards as a senior, 15 touchdowns on the ground, 7.5 yards per carry in 2013, on his way to being a second-round pick in the 2014 draft. And I remember there were some concerns coming off of that year for Ohio State. Who was the next man up? It turned out to be Ezekiel Elliott. And that's who they thought it would be. But he went from a guy who was barely over the 200-yard mark the year before as a freshman to the bell cow for the Buckeyes. Almost 1,900 rushing yards as a sophomore in 2014, 18 touchdowns. And then if you remember, folks, what he did in the postseason, he went over 200 yards in the Big Ten championship game, went for 230 in the national semifinal, went for 246 on the ground against Oregon in the national championship game that year. Another name that I think folks have become quite familiar with through whether it's fantasy football or following college football, like Ezekiel Elliott, he went top 10 in the NFL draft. Bijan Robinson, he was picked by the Atlanta Falcons a couple of years ago. Just last season, he went for almost 2,000 total offensive yards as a second-year pro. He was brought to the Texas Longhorns program by Stan Drayton. He was the number one running back in the country. Drayton helped get that done, bringing him to Austin. And after he was an impressive freshman, that sophomore season, which proved to be Drayton's last with Texas back in 2021, he goes for 1,200 yards, 6 yards per carry, 11 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns as a receiver as well. And so those are some of the names I think people are probably remember more of late. But we got to throw it back, Daniel, to Philadelphia Eagles fan favorite Brian Westbrook, because this was the original star pupil of Stan Drayton. Back in his days at Villanova, he spent some time in his alma mater, Division III Allegheny in 1993, jumped to jobs at Eastern Michigan and Penn, and then settled in for a 4-year stay at Villanova. And during that time, he recruited Brian Westbrook, and he helped turn him into a star. In 1998, 1,000 rushing yards, six per carry, 12 touchdowns. But get this, 1,100 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns through the air. The first player in college football history 1,000 yards rushing, 1,000 yards receiving. He did that as a young running back under Stan Drayton's watch. Drayton moves on to higher levels of college football. Brian Westbrook becomes an All-American again at the FCS level, and he ultimately becomes a second-round pick of the Philadelphia Eagles, third-round pick, I should say, and a big-time player in his own regard, college football Hall of Famer. And so, Daniel, just a few names there, charting 25 years essentially of action. I can throw in others. You can look at what he did with Jordan Howard as a Chicago Bears rookie. That was the only time Howard made a Pro Bowl. That was the most successful season of Howard's career. That was also Stan Drayton's last season in the NFL. He made the move to the Texas Longhorns after that. And so if you're Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, and I know you're not, and I know these are different perspectives to jump into, but when you're kind of going through and navigating last week and you lose someone who's kind of a father figure to you and Jaywan Sider, the guy who brought you to campus, you've had highs and lows with him, you're wondering what's next. You're already locked in for this extra season. What is your reaction when you find out it's Stan Drayton and he's got that kind of a track record?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gives you, a lot of confidence. I don't think that Nick Singleton and Katron Allen would have been concerned about who the next running backs coach would be. But I think that, any uncertainty or anything like that can definitely be assuaged by looking at this list of names and what they accomplished. And they're all kind of different backs too. You've got a lot of different styles there, a couple different systems, everything along those lines. I think the one thing that stands out to me looking through that list of players is the dual threat ability of some of these running backs. Obviously, Brian Westbrook takes it to the extreme with the two 1,000 yard seasons, receiving and rushing. But Bijan Robinson is someone who in the NFL we've seen him used as a pass catcher. Ezekiel Elliott had a couple years with the Cowboys earlier in his career where he caught a lot of balls. And so I think what Stan Drayton has been able to do is really develop a couple more versatile types of running backs. I know that Jordan Howard doesn't necessarily fit that mold, different kind of running back there. But, to have that flexibility to be able to coach guys to do a lot of different things, especially in today's college football. I mean, coaches want to put you in any position to be successful. I'm sure that if Andy Kotelnicki is thinking about, we saw the steps that Nick Singleton has taken forward as a receiver. Katron Allen, I think earlier in his career had some good flashes as a receiver. if Stan Drayton can help them, up that a little bit, I'm sure Kodal Nicky is looking at things and being like, okay, this could help us out. This could make things, we could add something new, some other wrinkles. I just think that Stan Drayton is someone who has made some well-rounded running backs who can do a lot of different things, and make things happen in different phases of the game. And I think if you're Nick Singleton and Katron Allen and thinking about what's next at that next level, getting drafted, finding a home in the NFL, more things you can do, the more appealing you're going to be. And I think Stan Drayton can show them that he can help them be that.
3 different decades you can point to Stan Drayton producing 1,000-yard rushers. You go all the way back to 1994 at Eastern Michigan with Stephen Whitfield. Only one rushing season in that program has topped it in the last 30 years. And then more recently, his last year in college football, Bijan Robinson on his way to being a top 10 pick. Different kinds of talent, as you said. And all due respect to Stephen Whitfield, I don't know how many offers he had before he landed at Eastern Michigan in the mid-'90s. Bijan Robinson was the number 1 running back recruit in America before Stan Drayton got his hands on him in that room. And when we look at what's next at running back, because we can talk about Nick Singleton and Katron Allen all day, but ultimately they're going to be unavailable for the Nittany Lions, whether that's in 2026 when they're playing in the NFL or if they deal with some kind of injury setback. And knock on wood here, I really am doing it. Nick Singleton has missed 1 game in his career. Katron Allen has not missed any games in his career. So it hasn't been a problem to this point, but we work our way through the depth chart, and it's not quite a depth chart yet. It's more of a collection of names, Daniel, as we got to figure out where guys stack up. And Cam Wallace was kind of the buzzier name coming out of preseason camp last year behind those two. He had earned the RB3 job, and when we got to see him in some game action, scored a touchdown, and then unfortunately suffered a pretty severe injury, multiple injuries. That's going to keep him out, not just last season, but I think we're going to be monitoring his progress here for a ways in 2025. So we're kind of going to put him to the side for this topic of conversation. You've got 2 returning redshirt freshmen in Quentin Martin and Corey Smith, a couple guys that we had a chance to hear from last week. Then you've got a freshman, Tyke Hayes. We've heard really good things about how he has kind of shown up here to campus this winter and really led people to believe that he might be able to do some things in year 1. You're going to have Jabri Wallace-Coleman coming in from Philadelphia this summer and joining that mix. So it's Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, and then 5 guys who are considered either sophomores or freshmen in terms of eligibility. 4 of them considered freshmen. So much to sort through here, Daniel. Among those names, if you were to kind of place a flyer on one of them right now in February for what their role might look like in the fall, who would you feel most comfortable placing that on?
I mean, to start, I know that you mentioned that we'll be monitoring him, but I look forward to the chance I can predict Cam Wallace to have a 70-yard touchdown run in garbage time of a non-conference game. I think that's when we'll know that he's back, when we can make that prediction for the 3rd straight year. But I mean, I think that Quentin Martin remains really intriguing. Corey Smith Flashmore, he had that big run against Washington in the whiteout. I thought he did some other really nice things. In his appearances. I know that I forget when, but there's kind of a similarity between Corey Smith and Quentin Martin as Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, in terms of you've got the one guy who's the higher rated in-state guy that everyone around the program, everyone around Pennsylvania has known for a long time. And then you've got, the Katron Allen, the Corey Smith, guys who are good running backs, highly regarded recruits in their own right, but are, just because of where they come from and the way the process works, people aren't as familiar with them, but they've been able to introduce themselves in a big way. But I just think Quentin Martin is the unique body type, unique skill set. I know coming out, he was an athlete for a long time in the recruiting rankings and could have gone a lot of different directions. But I think that he's someone that I'm excited to see get, who knows when it'll be, but more sustained work, as opposed to coming in for, 1 snap against USC for a gadget play, or just making a, appearance as a kick returner here and there. He's just unique to me, that I want to see what it looks like with him for a full drive, within the flow of an offense, not in a 4-minute offense, something like that. So I think that Martin is where I would start. I think that, Corey Smith is, going to be a factor in terms of however the step chart looks once we get to the fall. And then Hayes and Wallace-Coleman, it's similar to what we talked about, I think 2 years ago, when Wallace and London Montgomery came in, where the way that things were set up, you didn't need them to be able to produce right away. You didn't need to rush them. You could take your time with them a little bit. Obviously, Javon Sider was saying, hey, you're here. You need to compete. You need to act like you're pushing for time on the field. But those guys aren't going to be put, theoretically aren't going to be put in situations that they're not ready for. And we'll be able to see what Stan Drayton is like as a developer when these guys get here and what they look like over the course of the year. They're two guys that have been on the radar for in-state people for a really, really long time at both ends of the state. Jabri Wallace Coleman's recruitment was a little bit of a roller coaster at different points, and now they're here, and I'm excited to see what it looks like when they're getting this day-to-day coaching from someone like Drayton.
I suspect we'll get some longer looks at these younger pieces of the running back room come our trip to Beaver Stadium in April for the blue-white game, whatever that looks like this year, that version of the blue-white game. Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, I don't think we really need to see much from them in Beaver Stadium until the lights come back on next fall. And by the way, in terms of development, maybe figuring out who the third running back is, I would anticipate this is a process that process, unless someone really just sprints away with it, Daniel, that could last well into September. Because what do you have on that schedule? Nevada, Florida International, Villanova, bye week. That gives you a full month. That gives you 180 minutes of football to figure out what you've got behind Nick Singleton, Katron Allen before you play Oregon in that final weekend of September. So I think that's a great thing for Stan Drayton and these running backs. I hate to look past opponents like that, but we're not in the Lash building, so we can do that with a little more ease than they can. And so I think there's an opportunity there. And of course, by the way, Messiah Mickens is a storyline we'll be monitoring, one of the top running backs in the 2026 recruiting class out of Harrisburg High School. Plans to visit some other schools, but he also has an official visit locked in with Penn State. He announced that earlier Tuesday. Tyler Calvaruso broke down things with him and 2027 running back commit Kamon Spell on our last episode of the podcast. I wanted to jump over into the receiving room with you a little bit, Daniel, for this episode, because as we've seen some changes in the running back room, there have certainly been those at receiver, and that was anticipated for different reasons. While running back finished off the postseason run on a high note, and what those guys were able to accomplish in playoff action, including the Orange Bowl, was not the case for receivers. And of course, that culminated in a 0-catch performance for that room against Notre Dame in the semifinal matchup. Since then, we've seen 4 Penn State receivers leave via the transfer portal. Harrison Wallace is now at Ole Miss. Omari Evans is at Washington. Tyler Johnson is at East Carolina. Mekhi Flowers at Akron. He'll be playing safety, which is where he started his career at Penn State. We've seen 2 transfers added to this room, and Kyron Hudson out of USC, Devontae Ross, a 1,000-yard receiver last year at Troy. And then we've seen a few freshmen too. Lyric Samuel, Kobe Howard came on board during playoff preparation. Matthew Outen followed them. He's on campus. Jeff Exeter Jr. will join the group later this summer. And you want to talk about returners, Daniel? This is a list that I think is going to scare some people when they hear it, when they see it, because these are the guys who played ball for you, have practiced for you, have been Nittany Lions in our back. It's Liam Clifford, Caden Saunders, Anthony Ivey, Tyseer Denmark, Josiah Brown, and Peter Gonzalez, who missed last season as a freshman due to an injury. So look, the returner list isn't very robust, and there's a lot happening on the exit door and on the entrance door to this room. It's still the same coach, though. He's in year 3, and Marcus Hagans, if he's not feeling it, I think we're all sensing it. This is a huge year for him and a huge year for the receiver room. It cannot be 3 consecutive years where we get to December and January and everybody's walking around on eggshells wondering when the receiver room is going to hurt the program.
Yeah, I think it's the room that's going to have a lot of attention on it. I know that on various social media channels, if I share a story that is positive about what is happening in one area of the program, I'll get a response that is, this is good and all, but what about the wide receivers? And
Daniel, I got about 5 or 6 incredibly unique responses to the Jim Knowles hire that said, "Can he coach receivers?"
Exactly. And my response has been, we'll get there. Like it's February. Winter workouts haven't even started yet. I think we got some positive feedback from Ethan Grunkemeyer and Tyseer Denmark when they talked last week about the additions of Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross and what they think those guys can bring to the room. But we'll see. They're not in pads yet. They're not in practice yet. This is going to be a bit of a process. But I think it's at a unique spot. I think that you talk about at this point for year 3 for Marcus Hagans, you've turned things over a little bit. You've brought in some guys that he has recruited. I think that to have guys that know it's not going to work out or it hasn't worked out, to have those guys move on, I think that that's good turnover in a certain respect in terms of getting the room to where you want it. But we'll see. It's going to be interesting offseason. I think that there are a lot of interesting pieces in the room. I think that what Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross bring is unique to unique skill sets and the overall personnel in the group now. But you're going to have a lot of guys that are going to need to grow up and move quickly. Caden Saunders didn't play an offensive snap last year. Anthony Ivy has barely played during his 3 years. Tysier Denmark got to travel. I think he got to see a lot. He got a lot of reps. He got out there in games in a couple different situations. I think he's someone that there's going to be a lot of eyes on to take a step forward. And then Josiah Brown and Peter Gonzalez, we'll see. Those are guys that I think we liked in the recruiting process. We liked on the camp circuit, but we haven't seen them. And then there's early enrollees. How fast can you get up to speed? What kind of position can you put yourself in? It's just going to be, I think really interesting to see how all of this shakes out. I'm not even really sure what this is going to look like by the time we get to the blue-white game, by the time we get to Nevada on August 30th. There's a lot of different directions that this could go. As you have in our notes, there's Jeff Exner Jr. still needs to get to campus. What does the spring transfer portal window look like? Who can you add? Who's available? I think there's still a lot of different directions that this can go. But we'll see what it looks like when all this dust settles, when we finally get eyes on some of these guys and what they're able to do.
Liam Clifford had 18 catches last year. He has 39 catches on his career. No returning Nittany Lion has double-digit catches in their college career, even 10 of them. We know Caden Saunders this time last year, we thought he might be on the rise. Ultimately, an injury derailed things, and he wasn't able to get back into the mix at receiver in a year where it felt wide open for somebody to get into the mix at receiver. Same for Anthony Ivy. And you think about what they've added during the Marcus Hagan's run here. 2023, they added 3 new players at receiver. They were all one and done with the program. Carmelo Taylor, a little bit different reasoning there as a freshman, but you had 2 transfers additions in Dante Cephas and in Malik McClain, who had multiple years of eligibility. They were not productive. They were with you for one season. Last year, Penn State added 4 receivers, one of which was hurt during preseason camp. Peter Gonzalez not available. Neither of the other freshmen able to break through as rotational pieces ultimately. And then the transfer pickup for you, Julian Fleming. We've heard a lot about the presence. We know what the presence was like. We also know the production wasn't really there in a way that Penn State probably needed at that position. And then this year, 5 guys added to the equation as of now. Actually 6 when you factor in Jeff Exner Jr. coming to campus. And as you said, big question mark is, will there be a 7th? Because I think if you kind of polled Penn State fans, the great cherry on top of this offseason would be to go into the portal in late April and come away with someone who looks like they could be a bona fide number 1 receiver for you, and to kind of stack that onto the staff moves that they've been able to make in the roster retention. But a couple things there. If there is a bona fide number 1 receiver in the transfer portal, he's going to have sharks circling around him, and Penn State's not going to be the only one. And what is it going to take to get him to campus? We know James Franklin often says he doesn't want to poison the well. He doesn't want to jeopardize his roster and kind of their culture. And if a receiver's out there commanding a lot of money and he shows up and he's making a lot of money, and you've got guys on your team for 3 or 4 years and they've got starts and they're not making that kind of money, those are the kind of problems that you maybe have to address, and you have to be willing to balance those kind of decisions when you add somebody and when you make financial commitments, because you're not going to add a receiver just because you're selling him on a vision. You got to sell him on the vision and on what's going to happen to his bank account. It comes spring, summer, and fall, and it's all got to make sense and add up. So, Daniel, we have a lot to learn about this group, but I thought it was an appropriate time to kind of jump into it with Mekhi Flowers being confirmed as heading to Akron early this week, and that kind of puts an end to a lot of the guys that left. We're starting to learn about those who came. We have some intel up on Lions247 about the additions at receiver and Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross. We'll have some more of that as this winter continues into spring. Daniel, I wanted to finish off with a note on some offensive players that we haven't mentioned yet who carried momentum into this offseason. We did this a little bit with Mark Brennan a few weeks ago when Jim Knowles was introduced as defensive coordinator, talked about some of those defensive players on that side of the ball who brought momentum into the offseason. And Quite frankly, we probably can begin this with one guy that we did discuss already, Kaytron Allen, and what he accomplished in the postseason. We talked about it in real time down in Florida and when you were down in Arizona and it was all happening, we were covering it. He became a kind of factor and a playmaker that I think a lot of us just assumed he would not be for the remainder of his Penn State career. I think a lot of us got to October, November last year, saw Kaytron Allen was struggling to produce 4 yards per carry in most of those games and maybe thought his career was about to come to a close with more of a whimper. It did not happen that way. Instead, he was kind of the spearhead offensively during that postseason run, and he was fantastic and as good as any running back could really hope to be in a playoff scenario like this, especially when he's sharing the job. And so I guess we got to start there because if Kaytron Allen can pick up where he left off, man, he's going to make himself a lot of money at the next level, and he is going to put this Penn State rushing attack above just about anybody in America because I think Nick Singleton found his way again over the course of his junior year.
Yeah, when we talked about this exercise and I was thinking about it, Allen and Singleton was where I started because you think about what the middle of the season was like. I think what October was like for Singleton, what November was like for Allen. I think that's how it lined up. Like it was pretty rough. Like it was the stat lines are, I think, some of the uglier ones you'll see for a running back, no matter the level of football. And I think going into that Big Ten championship game, it was kind of like,
can I give you the last 3 stat lines of the regular season for Kaytron Allen?
Yes.
He had 7 carries for 10 yards. 6 carries for 20 yards at Purdue, 7 carries for 10 yards at Minnesota, 13 carries for 34 yards in the finale against Maryland. That's where he was momentum wise going out to Indianapolis to play Oregon.
Yeah. And this is kind of a mildly off topic, but you talk about where Singleton and Allen are in terms of the all-time rushing record at Penn State and what they need to get there. I know that a lot of people will point to they played 16 games. No Penn State player has ever played 16 games in a season before, and neither has missed much time. But I think the big key for those guys to get to that landmark is they're going to have to avoid stretches like they had. Where they both essentially disappeared at different spots during the season. I think some of that is health related, and obviously at running back, you want to avoid injuries to be effective. But just kind of avoiding those lulls, I think, is a big key to getting to those records beyond just they're going to have extra games if Penn State makes the playoff. But I think with going to Indianapolis and when we got there, like Kaytron Allen was like spearheading a comeback against a high-powered offense on the ground. You're down by, I think, 3 scores in the first half, and you're running the ball, and it's working, and it gets you back within 8 points. You put you in position to win the game late. I think it was just a really, really impressive performance down the stretch. It'll be interesting when we get the chance to talk to Kaytron Allen about what changed for him, during that stretch and what has gone into that decision to come back for another year at Penn State. But I think when you talk about how the season ended, the guys on the offensive side of the ball that were a big reason for it, Kaytron Allen is, I think, at the top of the list.
Kaytron Allen, if my math that I did very quickly during while you're talking there is correct, Kaytron Allen was just shy of 700 rushing yards at the end of the regular season, and then he put together more than 400 rushing yards in the postseason in 4 games there. So definitely a guy who flipped that switch, whatever you want to call it. And Nick Singleton, maintained momentum late in the season after his injury and just continued that in the playoffs. And so when they combined those forces, it was special to watch. Another name we got to get to because late he was such a pivotal piece of the ground game, really stepped up as a run blocker, Nolan Rucci. And run blocking was my key concern when Anthony Donko went down in November with the season-ending injury, and we knew that Rucci was going to be filling that right tackle spot the rest of the way. I just thought when you took on some of the big boys in the trenches, as things got tougher in the postseason, maybe he would get exposed. He got better and better and better. And when you look at PFF ratings, which you can take him or leave him, he was one of the top-rated offensive linemen in the postseason across college football, and he was Penn State's top-rated offensive lineman. So Anthony Donko has a recovery process ahead of him. It was a late-season injury. Really curious to see what his situation looks like come preseason camp. But Nolan Rucci's going to have a hard time if he maintains his momentum of coming out of that lineup, because when you talk about the size he has, the physical developments he's made at Penn State, and now the film he has accrued, not to mention his pedigree, son of a former NFL player, former 5-star prospect. I mean, he has the makings of a guy who could be a late riser as a top-tier NFL prospect if it comes together for him.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see if Nolan Ricci can continue that momentum into the year. Because I know that we've seen people, I think in the immediate aftermath of the season, write off Donko a little bit and say, well, now Rucci's the right tackle. And I think there's a reason why Ricci was not playing much over the course of the year, why Donko was playing so much. I think that it was one of those cases where it's watch what they do, not what they say, where it was presented, I think, going into the year that, it'll be a little bit of a timeshare, like we've seen at Penn State do at other spots on the offensive line over the course of the year. Now, once we got into the games, that was not the case at all. Like, it was the Anthony Donka show at right tackle. And, listening to people that are smarter than me when it comes to offensive line play, he might have been their best offensive lineman at stretches this year. So I think that when you talk about the O-line, you want to have as many bodies as there as possible. You want to have as many playable guys because, as we've seen countless times, one injury can really upset things as you're moving forward. We saw Penn State have the depth to weather one of those injuries late with how Ricci stepped up for Donko. So I think the more playable guys you have there, the better. It's going to be a really fun competition as you go across the year. I think that Penn State under Phil Troutline has done a nice job of incentivizing players in these competitions where if you're good enough, you will play no matter what, that they will find spots for you on the field, find different ways to use you at different points in the game. So that's going to be an interesting competition. Hopefully next time we talk to James Franklin, we can get some, a little bit more of an outlook on what's ahead for Donko in terms of recovery, availability, things like that. But yeah, I think Ricci is definitely in that number 2 spot behind Katron Allen.
Ricci is one of 6 returning offensive linemen. I shouldn't say returning because TJ Shanahan's in this mix. 6 offensive linemen Penn State has on the roster have started at least 6 games. That includes JB Nelson, who wasn't a starter last year, and then TJ Shanahan, who started several games in the SEC for Texas A&M. Daniel, as we finish out this exercise, I found pretty quickly that because you only play one quarterback, and because we already talked about what happened at wide receiver, there's just not as many names to point to that are obvious here as there were on the defensive side of the ball at 3 different levels. But one that I think maybe a little under the radar because it's not so much a statistical jump as it was just his presence, accruing snaps, and what we've heard about him since then in the facility. Khalil Dinkins, a redshirt junior tight end last year. It was the Tyler Warren show, top 10 Heisman Trophy voting. We know that. But as much attention as we paid to Luke Reynolds playing a bunch of ball and burying his redshirt as a 5-star freshman, Khalil Dinkins was the number 2 tight end for essentially, once he got through those early season injuries, he was the guy. He was locked in. He was playing 30-plus snaps a bunch. He had 14 catches on the year. He had 9 catches coming into the season. A couple touchdowns for Khalil. But again, I think it goes beyond production because in my mind, we're talking about the pass catching prowess that Tyler Warren brought to the field. People are going to start to see if the opportunities are upticking for him. Khalil Dinkins has some of the softer hands on this team. They love his receiving skills. He's come a long way as a blocker. And I think the way they talked about his physicality in the Lash building in December and January and the way he finished things out leads you to believe that he is, no matter what Rapplier does coming off an injury, no matter how good a guy like Andrew Olish looks or how much Luke Reynolds makes strides in year 2, Khalil Dinkins is going to be entrenched in that tight end conversation. And they're going to play a bunch of those guys again. But I think Dinkins is a guy that maybe people are looking past a bit.
Definitely falls into the underappreciated, underrated category when you think about all the shiny objects that Penn State has at tight end now. But yeah, I agree with that. I think that Dinkins is someone who can do a lot of different things for you. He's shown that he's not afraid to get down and dirty when it comes to blocking. And we know that physicality is appreciated by Ty Howell, by James Franklin, by Andy Kotelnicki. And that's something that over the course of a 14, 15, 16, 17 game season, you're going to need a lot of that. And so I think that Dinkins has shown that you can throw him the ball in big spots and he's going to haul it in. A lot of 4th down catches, a lot of red zone catches on that resume. So I'm curious to see what it looks like for him building forward. I mean, I'm probably guilty of it as well. When you talk about Andrew Rapplier coming off injury, what Luke Reynolds can do in year 2, how does Andrew Olish come in? All the other tight ends that they signed. It's a young room. It's a talented room. But in terms of age, playing time, Khalil Dinkins is at the top right now. And I think that he's a unique player. He's athletic, and I'm excited to see what he'll be able to do.
A reminder that his dad, Darnell Dinkins, went to Pitt, then played a decade of tight end in the NFL, won a Super Bowl championship as well. That's going to do it for this episode of the Lions247 Podcast. Daniel, really appreciate you joining me to break things down. We'll bring another episode your way later this week. In the meantime, go to Lions247.com for a bunch of coverage on recruiting, on this Penn State roster, on the evolving staff. It's a really interesting time of the year. And if you want to, there's some basketball coverage there as well from Daniel and Mark.
Not for the faint of heart.
I'm Tyler Donahue, and this has been the Lions247 Podcast.